The small town of Düren, located in the heart of Germany, was once a peaceful and thriving community, nestled among the rolling hills of the Rhineland. Before the war, it had been a quiet place where children played in the streets, families gathered for meals, and life moved with a rhythm that spoke of stability and normalcy. But that world had been shattered, like so many others across Europe, when the horrors of war descended upon it. As the relentless bombardment of World War II raged on, Düren became yet another casualty of the conflict, a town reduced to rubble under the unyielding force of the Allied air raids. The night sky, once clear and starry, was now constantly filled with the roar of bombers, the flashes of explosions lighting up the horizon. With each passing day, the residents of Düren found their world growing smaller and more insufferable. The once bustling streets were now eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of footsteps or the distant rumble of more bombs dropping from the sky. The familiar structures, houses, shops, and schools were no more than jagged remnants of their former selves, reduced to piles of debris and ash. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burning, the scent of lives lost and futures stolen. In the midst of this devastation, a group of children found themselves trapped in the broken heart of a town that no longer existed. These children, whose faces had once been bright with laughter and curiosity, now wore expressions of hollow resignation, their small bodies frail from hunger and exhaustion. They had witnessed horrors beyond their years, homes destroyed, families torn apart, and the cold indifference of war taking everything away from them. Some had lost parents, others had been abandoned as the chaos of the air raids descended, and still others had been separated from their loved ones during frantic evacuations. What remained was a group of orphans, left to fend for themselves in a world that seemed to have no place for them. The hunger was the worst part. It gnawed at them, making their stomachs ache and their limbs weak. The once nourishing food that had filled their homes was now a distant memory, replaced by scraps and leftovers scavenged from the remains of destroyed buildings. There was no longer enough to go around, and what little they could find was often stale or spoiled. Their faces, once full of life, were now gaunt, their cheeks sunken and pale. Eyes that had once sparkled with curiosity and hope were now dull and clouded with fear, uncertainty, and hunger. Yet, it was not just the physical suffering that weighed heavily on them. It was the emotional and psychological toll of war, the constant fear that they would be next to be caught in an air raid, the knowledge that their lives had been upended in ways they could scarcely comprehend. Every sound of an approaching plane sent them into a frenzy, scrambling for shelter wherever they could find it, their hearts pounding in their chests as they huddled together in fear. Even the sound of footsteps outside their makeshift homes could send a wave of panic through their small bodies, for it might mean another raid, another round of destruction, or worse, more soldiers looking for someone, to punish. Despite their young age, these children had already learned the painful lessons of survival. They had learned that the world was a cruel place, that safety was an illusion, and that survival came at a great cost. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford, and each day was a battle to simply stay alive. Their experiences had taught them that kindness was rare, a fleeting thing that could not be relied upon, and that punishment was always just around the corner. And yet, in the midst of this bleak existence, there was a strange and unexpected stillness that often descended upon them. In the empty rooms of shattered buildings, or in the corners of darkened alleys, the children would sit together in silence, waiting for what would come next. It was not the silence of peace, but of a collective understanding that something dark and inevitable was on the horizon. It was as if the world had come to a halt, suspended between the horrors of the present and the uncertainty of the future. In these moments of quiet, the children would often cling to each other, finding solace in their shared suffering. They would not speak much, for words seemed inadequate in the face of the horrors they had witnessed. The simple act of being together was enough, an unspoken bond formed through their mutual loss, their shared longing for something better. They had learned to rely on each other, to offer what little comfort they could in the face of overwhelming despair. And yet, even in these moments of solidarity, there was an unspoken understanding that they were powerless to change their fate. For them, survival was all that mattered. There was no time for dreams, no room for the hope of a better tomorrow. They were children, yes, but they had been forced to grow up far too quickly, learning lessons that no one should ever have to learn. Their world had become one of survival, where each day was a struggle to hold on to life, to protect the fragile flicker of existence that still burned within them. They did not know what the future held, but they could not afford to think about it for long. There was too much to endure in the present. The arrival of British bombers overhead was a constant reminder of the world beyond Durin, a world at war. The children did not fully understand the reasons behind the conflict, but they knew enough to fear the soldiers who fought on both sides. To them, the British were just another part of the faceless machinery of war, distant and impersonal, their presence a constant threat to their already fragile existence. They had been taught to fear them, just as they had been taught to fear the German soldiers who roamed the streets. But in the hearts of these young ones, there was also a flicker of something else, an aching longing for the war to end, for the suffering to cease, for the world to return to some semblance of peace. Still, that peace seemed as distant as the stars above. For now, they could only wait. Wait for the next air raid, wait for the next wave of destruction, wait for the next round of suffering to begin. In the dimly lit rooms of their broken homes, they sat in silence, their small bodies curled up together, clutching whatever meager possessions they had managed to salvage. They were hungry, they were tired, and they were scared. But above all, they were waiting for a punishment they could not avoid, for a fate that seemed inevitable. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next, until it seemed as though time itself had been suspended. The children could no longer remember the last time they had seen sunlight without the clouds of war hanging over it. The only light that seemed to exist was the flicker of firelight, the glow of burning buildings, and the harsh glare of searchlights sweeping across the sky. The world outside was a battlefield, and the children were but tiny, fragile pawns caught in the middle. As they waited, their minds would often drift, though they had learned not to dream too deeply. In the rare moments when they could forget the hunger and the fear, when they could close their eyes and escape into the shadows of their memories, they would remember a time before the war, before the bombs had fallen, before their homes had been destroyed, before everything had been taken from them. It was a brief and fleeting memory, one they could never fully grasp, but it was enough to remind them of what they had lost. In the cold silence of Durin's ruins, the children waited, their stomachs empty but their hearts full of a quiet, desperate hope. They did not know what the future would bring, or whether they would survive the coming days. All they knew was that they could not wait forever, and that the world outside was moving forward, carrying them toward an uncertain fate. The one thing they were certain of was that they could no longer endure the present. Something had to change. Something had to give. And yet, in their small, shattered room, the children could do nothing but wait. The children sat huddled together in the dimly lit room, their small faces gaunt with hunger and fear. Each one had their own story, a story marked by loss and the brutal realities of war. But for all their differences, there was a shared experience that bound them together, a shared sense of helplessness in the face of a world that had come to a halt. The room was small, cold, and silent, the air heavy with a sense of waiting. Time seemed to move differently in this place, dragging on in endless minutes that felt like hours. The walls, once solid and warm, had been reduced to broken fragments, like the town itself. There were no sounds of laughter, no games or conversations, only the occasional cough, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional cry of a child still too young to understand the full weight of their situation. Outside, the once bustling streets of Durin were now ghostly quiet. The bombing raids had taken their toll, leaving the city in ruins. The streets were littered with debris, broken glass, twisted metal, the remnants of homes and livelihoods. The war had turned everything into a fragmented memory, a shell of what it once was. People had fled, but those who remained were either too old, too ill, or too young to escape. The town, which had once been filled with the vibrancy of life, now stood as a monument to loss, to the ravages of conflict that spared no one. In this broken world, the children could no longer rely on their families to protect them. Parents had been lost in the bombing raids, or they had been sent away to fight in distant battles, leaving their children to face the aftermath alone. Many of the children had never known a life without war. For them, the war was not a distant concept. It was their everyday reality. It had shaped their world in ways they couldn't fully understand but had learned to navigate. They understood that food was a luxury, that shelter was temporary, and that survival meant staying quiet, staying small, and staying out of sight. They understood that kindness was a rare commodity, something to be both sought and feared in equal measure. Trust was a currency they couldn't afford, and they had learned to guard their hearts, to keep their expectations low. The enemy was not just the soldiers who fought on the front lines but also the indifferent forces of fate that seemed to target them with the precision of a weapon. Yet, amid the hopelessness that hung in the air like a thick fog, there was a faint whisper of something else, an uncertain hope that something might change. It was a fragile hope, born not of certainty but of sheer necessity. The children had heard rumors, whispers passed from older survivors and people who had returned from other towns, of a British relief effort making its way across the country. They spoke of food, of safety, and, most importantly, of a kindness that could come from an enemy they had been taught to fear. At first, the children did not know what to make of these stories. They had been taught from a young age that the British were not to be trusted. They had been raised on a steady diet of propaganda, their minds filled with images of British soldiers as ruthless invaders, the enemy who sought only to destroy everything that was German. The war had given them no reason to believe that anyone could be trusted, especially the enemy. But in the stillness of the room, where there was nothing left to hold on to except fleeting memories of better times, even the smallest flicker of hope could feel like a lifeline. The children, hungry and tired, had nothing to lose by believing the stories. What could be worse than what they had already endured? They had seen destruction, death, and despair up close, and if there was even the smallest chance that someone might offer them something more than cruelty, they were willing to entertain the idea. The room remained quiet, save for the occasional rustle of cloth or the distant sound of planes overhead. The children's eyes darted toward the window, hoping for any sign that the stories were true, that help might come, that someone might come to offer them what they had been denied for so long. But as the days dragged on, their hope began to wane. The sky remained as gray and oppressive as it had always been, and the ground beneath their feet felt like a constant reminder of how little control they had over their own fate. The hunger gnawed at them, a constant companion that never let them forget the fragility of their existence. The children sat together, their eyes searching the street below, waiting for something, anything, that might signal a change. But when the first soldiers arrived, they came not with the harsh, unforgiving presence the children had expected, but with an odd quietness that unsettled them. It was not the clatter of boots, the yelling commands, or the shrill sound of guns that filled the air. Instead, there was something different about these soldiers. Their movements were measured, deliberate, and despite the heavy weight of the war that had followed them across Europe, they moved with a certain calmness that felt unfamiliar and disconcerting. The children watched from the window, their hearts beating faster as the British soldiers moved through the rubble of the city. The soldiers were not the monstrous figures of hatred they had been taught about. They were men, weary and worn, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their eyes carried something else, something unexpected. For a moment, the children froze. They had been prepared for this moment, or so they thought. They had prepared themselves for the inevitable clash with their enemies, for the punishment they expected would come from those who had done so much to destroy their world. But this was different. The soldiers did not come as conquerors, nor did they come with weapons raised, ready to take lives. They came with a mission, one that was not about victory but about something entirely different. The soldiers began to move through the broken streets, their presence a contrast to the destruction that surrounded them. Where the children had seen only devastation, the soldiers saw a chance to provide something more, a brief, fleeting glimpse of humanity amid the chaos. It was not an act of kindness they had come for, but it would become one. The children, watching from their hiding spots, felt a strange unease settle in their chests. The stories they had heard, the rumors of bread and warmth, now seemed like an impossible dream. They had learned not to trust in dreams. Still, they could not look away as the soldiers approached their building, their boots crunching against the glass and rubble that littered the streets. The children had been waiting for a long time, but nothing had prepared them for this moment. They had imagined punishment, harsh, unforgiving like the rest of the world. But now, standing at the threshold of their door, they were unsure what to expect. They had braced themselves for violence, for more suffering. But in their hearts, a tiny part of them, the part that had clung to hope for so long, whispered that there might be something else waiting for them. The door creaked open, and the first soldier stepped into the room. His face was weathered, his uniform dirt-streaked and worn, but there was no malice in his eyes. He paused, as though unsure of what he was seeing. The children, staring back at him, said nothing, but their wide eyes spoke volumes. For a moment, the room held its breath. No one moved, not even the soldier. And then the unthinkable happened. He reached into his bag, pulling out something that seemed almost too simple: bread. The children blinked, unsure whether they were imagining it. Their hearts began to race, a strange mix of confusion and disbelief flooding their minds. Bread, the symbol of life, of sustenance, of something they had not tasted in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't much, just a few loaves, broken and worn, but it was enough. Enough to remind them that even in the darkest corners of the world, there was still a glimmer of something better. The soldier moved carefully, passing the bread from one hand to another, offering it to the children who had no words, only trembling hands that reached out for it. As they took the bread, their tiny fingers trembling, the silence in the room deepened. The soldier stepped back, watching as they consumed the bread, their faces filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The room that had been filled with fear now felt different. It was no longer just a place of waiting, of hopelessness. It had become a place of unexpected kindness, a room where the simplest act, an offering of bread, had the power to change everything. The children stood in stunned silence, their hands still clutching the bread as though it were something fragile, something precious, something that could slip away as quickly as it had come. The soldier, his expression unreadable, stepped back to allow them space. For a long moment, nothing moved in the room except for the faint sound of chewing, the soft breaking of bread, and the quick, shallow breaths of children who had not known the sensation of a full stomach in what felt like years. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, like a dream that they feared would dissipate with the slightest movement. Their wide eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now held something new, cautious hope. They weren't sure what to make of the strange kindness that had been thrust upon them so unexpectedly. Was it a trick? Was this an illusion, a momentary lapse in the otherwise harsh reality that had been their lives for so long? But the bread was real. The bread filled their mouths, and with each bite, their hunger ebbed, albeit briefly, and they felt a warmth spreading through their bodies, a warmth they hadn't known in months. The bread, though simple and unsophisticated, was more than just food to them. It was a symbol of something they hadn't dared to hope for. For the first time in a long time, they felt as though they were seen, as though someone out there cared for them, however fleetingly. And yet, with every bite, they couldn't escape the nagging thought in the back of their minds. Why would the enemy do this for them? Why would the British soldiers, the very soldiers they had been taught to hate, to fear, and to distrust, offer them sustenance instead of punishment? The soldier remained still, watching them, his face softened by exhaustion but filled with a quiet resolve. He did not seem impatient, nor did he seem eager to leave. It was as though he understood, even in his own fatigue, the weight of the moment. The children, their small forms sitting huddled together, gradually lowered their hands from their mouths, no longer driven by hunger but by something else. Something like gratitude, though they didn't know the word for it. They had lived in a world where survival meant ignoring the kindness of others, where any generosity was viewed with suspicion, where every act of mercy was suspect, as it could easily be a precursor to something far worse. For the children of Durin, the war had not only taken their homes and their families but had robbed them of the very concept of kindness. They had learned that the world was a place of cruelty, a place where the strong survived at the expense of the weak. They had learned that soldiers, whether British, German, or any other, were to be feared, not revered. Soldiers were the harbingers of death, of destruction, of more suffering. But here, in this room, something had happened that defied everything they had been taught. They had been given bread, not as a reward, but as a simple act of humanity, as though the soldiers had seen them not as enemies, not as orphans, not as the spoils of war, but as human beings deserving of basic sustenance. As they chewed slowly, savoring the bread as though it were a luxury far beyond its worth, the room seemed to change. It was no longer just a place of despair and emptiness, filled with the remnants of war. It had become a space where something almost unthinkable had occurred. The boundaries between the enemy and themselves seemed to blur, and in their quiet chewing, in their careful glances toward each other, a subtle shift occurred. They were not just survivors anymore. They were participants in a moment of unexpected grace. The soldiers who had entered their lives as figures of fear and power were no longer those faceless, brutal forces of destruction. They had become something more complicated, something closer to human. The soldier stepped forward again, this time more cautiously, as though weighing his next move. His eyes met the children's, and for the first time, they saw something in them that they had never expected. They saw the weariness of a man who had seen too much, a soldier who had fought and bled, a man who had been part of the engine of war but who, in this moment, was simply offering his humanity. He wasn't speaking in harsh commands, nor was he demanding anything of them. He was just standing there, quietly present, offering not just bread but the most valuable thing a person could offer in such a time, compassion. The children, hesitant and still unsure, didn't know how to respond. They had been taught that kindness was often a mask for ulterior motives, a ruse to draw them in before the hammer of punishment fell. They had grown accustomed to cruelty, to the cold, unfeeling hands of the world. What was this, then? Why were these soldiers acting so differently? Could it really be true that, even amidst the destruction and chaos, a soldier could act with kindness? Could an enemy be someone who could offer food and warmth instead of pain and suffering? As the last of the bread was eaten, the room fell into a heavy silence, thick with unspoken questions and emotions too complex to voice. The soldier, sensing their confusion, turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back over his shoulder. There was no triumph in his eyes, no sense of superiority. There was only the tired gaze of a man who had lived through too many battles, too many lives lost, and too many moments like this. He nodded gently as if to say, "It's enough. This is all I can offer." And then, with that simple gesture, the soldier left, disappearing into the ruins of the town, his presence as quiet and unassuming as it had been when he first entered the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the children were left in the stillness that followed. For a long time, they did not speak. They sat in silence, each of them processing the moment in their own way, each of them trying to reconcile the image of the British soldier they had been taught to fear with the man who had stood before them and given them bread. The room was still cold, the shadows of war still clung to the walls, and the sounds of distant bombs could still be heard in the distance. The hunger, while briefly soothed, was not gone, and the future was still uncertain. But something had shifted in that room. The children had learned, perhaps for the first time in their short lives, that the world was not as simple as they had once believed. They had learned that the enemy was not always cruel, that kindness could come from places they had never imagined, and that even in the darkest hours, there were moments of light. It was not a grand change, not a shift that could erase the devastation or heal the wounds of war, but it was a start. It was a crack in the walls of their perceptions, a small opening through which they could glimpse something other than the shadows of fear. They had been hungry, yes. Hunger for food, hunger for warmth, hunger for human connection, but now they felt something else growing inside them, something fragile but real, the first stirrings of hope. The silence in the room was not oppressive anymore. It was full of something different, something almost tangible. The children, still unsure of what the future held, knew that in this moment, they had been part of something that defied the narrative they had been taught. They had been the recipients of mercy, not vengeance, and it was this mercy that, for the briefest of moments, transformed the air around them. It had been enough to change their perception of the world, if only slightly. It had given them something to hold on to, something to remember when the hunger came back, when the fear rose again. In that quiet, fractured room, the children were left alone, but they were not the same. The image of the soldier, the quiet act of kindness, would stay with them, perhaps for the rest of their lives. It would become a beacon, a reminder that even in the midst of war and destruction, there could be moments of grace, of shared humanity. And though they did not know it at the time, it would be a lesson that would shape them, one that would stay with them through the darkest of days. The room was still, too still, and the silence hung like a heavy fog, making the air feel denser, almost suffocating. The children, now less hungry but more filled with questions than ever, sat quietly in the same positions they had been in before the soldiers had arrived. Their hands, once trembling as they reached for the bread, now rested lightly in their laps. Their faces, still gaunt with hunger and their eyes still wide from the unexpected act of kindness, reflected a deep uncertainty. It was as though the bread they had been given had unlocked a door they were unsure whether they should enter. The act itself had been so simple, so small. A loaf of bread passed between trembling hands, but it had reverberated in ways none of them could have anticipated. In that moment, the soldiers had given them far more than food. They had given them a glimpse into a possibility they had never dared to consider. The children, having come from a world where kindness was scarce, didn't know how to process what had happened. They had been raised on a steady diet of fear and suffering. The relentless air raids, the cold eyes of soldiers who saw them as nothing more than collateral damage, the constant gnawing hunger, all had taught them that survival was a solitary pursuit. They had learned that the only person who could be trusted was themselves. Even the fleeting memories of their families seemed distant, clouded by the passage of time and the brutality of war. They had grown accustomed to being ignored, to being invisible in the face of the greater forces of history that seemed to trample over them without a second thought. So, when the British soldiers had entered their lives, when they had offered bread instead of bullets, it shattered the world they had come to accept. But there was something else, too. A deeper layer of complexity began to settle within them. The feeling they had been left with, this strange, unsettling warmth, was both a gift and a curse. It was a gift because it had reminded them that there were people in the world who still had the capacity for compassion. It was a curse because it forced them to confront a world they had long since abandoned. Hope, Indiana. In that room, in that brief moment, they had been shown a truth they had not been prepared for. The world was not as simple as they had thought. The soldiers were not just faceless agents of destruction. They were men with lives, with choices, with a capacity for mercy. That realization was both freeing and paralyzing. How could the enemy offer them kindness? And what did that mean for everything they had been taught about who they were and who they should fear? The children turned to each other in the silence, exchanging glances, unsure of what to say. They had been through so much together, and now, in the wake of the soldiers' departure, they found themselves on the precipice of something new, something they didn't know how to name. Their eyes, once filled with suspicion, now carried a flicker of something else, something that, for the first time in a long time, felt like trust. But trust was fragile, especially for them. It wasn't something easily given. It had to be earned, and even then, it was always shadowed by the question of how long it would last, when it would be betrayed, and by whom. As the minutes stretched on, the room remained eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional shuffle of feet, the soft rustling of clothes, and the distant hum of life outside. The children were no longer focused on their hunger, nor were they consumed by the fear of what the future might hold. Instead, their minds had wandered, trying to piece together the meaning of what had just occurred. The bread had been given without any fanfare, without any expectation of gratitude. It had been offered simply because the soldier could, because he chose to. And yet, the gift felt monumental. It felt like something that could change everything if only they could understand it. One of the older children, a boy with dark, weary eyes, broke the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but it carried the weight of something much older than his years. He spoke of the bread, of the soldiers, of the feelings that had stirred within him since the moment they had entered the room. "Do you think they're like us?" he asked, his words hanging in the air. "Do you think they feel what we feel?" His question wasn't just about the soldiers. It was about the world, about the idea that, perhaps, they weren't as isolated as they had once believed. Perhaps there were connections to be made, even in the midst of a war that had driven everyone to the edge of humanity. The others looked at him, their faces unsure, but the question had opened something within them. For the first time, they weren't looking just at the soldiers as the enemy. They were looking at them as human beings. This shift, while subtle, was profound. The enemy had never been real to them in a way that made them feel connected to their own humanity. But now, with the bread in their bellies and the memory of the soldiers' unexpected kindness fresh in their minds, the walls that had long divided them from the world outside, walls built from fear, suspicion, and bitterness, began to crack. In the days that followed, the children began to talk about the soldiers more openly, though still with hesitation. They spoke of the warmth in the soldiers' eyes, of the quiet way they had entered the room, of the calmness in their demeanor despite the chaos that had consumed the town. It was as if the soldiers had stepped into a space that wasn't just a war zone, but a place where something deeper was at stake. The children wondered about the soldiers' own lives. Were they as scared as the children? Did they have families, homes, dreams that had been taken from them, just like the children's had been? The thought that these soldiers, whom they had been taught to see as cold-hearted destroyers, might have been as broken as they were, was an unsettling one. But it was also a thought that gave them a sense of connection to something larger, something beyond the confines of their own suffering. The room, too, had changed. The walls, once covered in the remnants of shattered glass and crumbling plaster, no longer felt like the cage they had once been. It had become a place where reflection was possible, where the children could begin to see their situation in a new light. The uncertainty of the future still loomed large, but it no longer felt as crushing. For the first time, they allowed themselves to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the endless cycle of survival. They hadn't seen it before, hadn't dared to imagine it. But now, with the memory of the bread still fresh on their tongues, they began to entertain the possibility of something more. The hunger wasn't gone, nor was the fear. But there was space, small though it was, for something else. A possibility for healing, for change, for connection. As the days went on, the children's lives continued in the same patterns of survival. The air raids still came, the hunger still gnawed at their insides, and the fear of what might come next never fully left. But something within them had shifted. The bread had not been a cure for all the pain they had endured, nor had it erased the destruction of their world. But it had cracked open a door to something else. It had shown them that even in the midst of suffering, there could be moments of grace. They began to talk to each other more, to share their thoughts and feelings, not just about the soldiers, but about their lives before the war, about the families they had lost, and about what they longed for in the future. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning that they had never thought possible before the bread had been passed into their hands. In that moment, the room felt less like a place of despair and more like a space for transformation. The soldiers had come and gone, leaving behind nothing but memories of an unlikely encounter. But the children were no longer just survivors, they were witnesses to something greater than themselves, something that had the potential to reshape the way they viewed the world. For all the devastation that surrounded them, the bread had reminded them that even in the darkest of times, kindness could still find its way through the cracks. And that, in itself, was enough to make them believe, if only for a moment, that a better world was possible. The days that followed were quieter than the children had expected. The bread had been a lifeline, but it was also a lingering question. As the children returned to their makeshift shelters and the broken remnants of their homes, they carried with them not just the physical relief of having eaten, but a subtle transformation that was harder to grasp. The soldiers, with their quiet acts of kindness, had changed something deep within them, something that had been buried beneath the rubble of war, something fragile and elusive. They had shown the children a glimmer of what might exist beyond the boundaries of survival, a world where mercy, however fleeting, could disrupt the relentless march of violence and fear. The children tried to make sense of it, but the simplicity of the moment was so profound that it defied explanation. They had expected punishment, they had expected to be seen as nothing more than casualties of a war that they hadn't asked for, but instead, they had been given bread. They had been given warmth, a rare commodity in a world that seemed to offer only coldness and destruction. There was a quiet shift that happened within them, a change that didn't happen all at once but grew slowly, imperceptibly. It was as though the act of kindness had planted a seed in each of them, and though they were too young to understand the full implications, they began to carry it with them quietly in the days that followed.